In the winter of 1347, a fisherman in Sicily woke up to help unload a ship that had arrived overnight from the east. He never came home. By the next morning, she stopped answering it. No merchants shouting prices in the market, just silence. And it wasn't just that street. It wasn't just that city. Within months, this silence was spreading across an entire continent, swallowing villages, emptying cathedrals, filling mass graves faster than anyone could dig them. In less than 5 years, Europe lost nearly half its population. Not to war, not to famine, to something no one could see, something no one understood, and something that, once it arrived at your door, there was almost no escaping. This is the story of how a disease emptied Europe, and how the world that survived it was never the same again. The world before, paradise before the fall. To understand how devastating this was, you first have to understand what Europe was before it happened. Because this was not a dark, struggling backward civilization waiting to collapse. This was the peak of the High Middle Ages, and it was thriving. For nearly 2 centuries, Europe had been experiencing something remarkable. The climate was unusually warm. Harvests were plentiful year after year. The population had nearly doubled. Cities that had sat quietly inside their old Roman walls were now bursting past them. Paris, Florence, Venice, London, packed, loud, alive, ambitious. The Gothic cathedrals were rising. Notre Dame, Cologne, Chartres. Enormous stone structures that took generations to build, symbols of a civilization that genuinely believed it was getting closer to God and closer to perfection at the same time. And the world was connected in a way it hadn't been since the Roman Empire. A merchant in Venice could buy silk that had traveled the entire length of Asia without ever leaving the trade routes secured by the Mongol Empire. Spices from India, gold from Africa. Ideas and inventions moving faster than ever before. This vast network, the medieval world's version of the internet, was making everyone richer and the world smaller. It was, by any measure, a golden age. But here is the thing about golden ages. Their greatest strength is often also their greatest weakness. All those roads, all those ships, all those busy ports connecting city to city and continent to continent, they were about to carry something that no merchant had bargained for. The infrastructure for paradise had also built the perfect infrastructure for catastrophe. The story does not begin in Europe. It begins thousands of miles away, in a place most Europeans had never seen and could barely imagine. The Central Asian steppes, an endless landscape of grass and wind and extreme temperatures. Modern-day Kyrgyzstan, northern China, a place of vast, brutal silence. Here, in the soil and in the burrows of small animals, marmots, ground squirrels, rats, a bacterium had been living quietly for centuries. Its name, in modern science, is Yersinia pestis. But in the 14th century, no one knew it existed. No one had any concept of bacteria at all. For generations, this organism lived in a kind of balance with the animals of the steppes, far from cities, far from trade routes, far from people. Then, in the 1330s, something changed. Climate historians believe a severe ecological disruption, possibly a prolonged drought followed by heavy rains, devastated the food sources of the steppe rodents. Starving and desperate, the infected animals began moving closer to human settlements, closer to the Silk Road trading posts, closer to the caravans moving east and west. The fleas on their bodies made the jump to humans. The first victims likely had no idea what was happening to them. A fever, vomiting, and then the swellings. Hard, painful, dark lumps appearing under the arms, along the neck, in the groin. The lymph nodes of the body, swollen to the size of an egg, sometimes the size of an apple, filled with a bacteria multiplying faster than the body could fight. These swellings were called buboes, and so the disease would later be called the bubonic plague. But in the early 1340s, it had no name yet. It was just death, moving west, following the trade routes, riding inside the very system that connected the world. The pivot point of this entire history sits on a small peninsula jutting into the Black Sea, a city called Kaffa. Kaffa was not a small town. It was a massive, fortified, extraordinarily wealthy trading colony, belonging to the Republic of Genoa, the hinge between the overland Asian routes and the maritime Mediterranean networks. Inside its stone walls lived Italian merchants, Armenian traders, and a cosmopolitan crowd protected by Genoese crossbowmen. It was one of the most valuable cities in the medieval world. In 1346, it was under siege. The army of the Golden Horde, a successor state of the Mongol Empire, led by Khan Jani Beg, had surrounded the city. But the Genoese were masters of defense. They had the walls. They had the sea for resupply. The siege dragged on for months in a brutal stalemate. And then the plague arrived in the Mongol camps. Soldiers began dying by the hundreds, then thousands, their bodies darkening with gangrene. The great Mongol army, which had conquered half the known world, was being dissolved not by enemy swords, but by something invisible. Jani Beg, watching his army disintegrate, made a decision that would change the course of history. He ordered the corpses of his plague-ridden soldiers loaded onto trebuchets, and he fired them over the walls of Kaffa. For days, the sky rained dead bodies into the city. The Genoese defenders watched in horror as pestilent corpses crashed onto rooftops and into market squares. The psychological terror was immense, but the biological impact was immediate. The bacteria carried in the fluids of the corpses, and in the fleas abandoning their cold dead hosts to find warm living ones, had entered the city. The unbreakable fortress had been breached from within. Panic took over. The wealthy Genoese merchants did what wealthy people with ships always do in a crisis. They ran. 12 Genoese galleys loaded with people, cargo, and unseen passengers slipped out of the harbor, past the dying Mongol army, and headed west, toward home, toward Europe. They had no idea what they were carrying. The ships sailed through the Bosphorus, past Constantinople, which would soon be devastated itself, into the open Mediterranean. The first major European port they reached was Messina in Sicily. When the dock workers rowed out to meet the arriving galleys, they found a scene that no one could have prepared for. Most of the sailors were dead, still on deck, rotting where they had fallen. The few still alive were delirious with fever, their bodies covered in black, weeping boils. The port authorities of Messina ordered the ships expelled immediately, but it was already too late. The black rats that lived on every medieval ship and the fleas on their backs had already used the mooring ropes to crawl onto the docks. They scattered into the city, into the granaries, into the homes, into the walls. Messina lasted weeks before the social fabric began to tear. People fled to the countryside, and in fleeing, they carried the disease with them across the island, then across the sea to the Italian mainland. Other ports tried to close their harbors. But greed is a powerful force. A ship carrying valuable spices could often bribe its way past a harbor master who was trying to keep his family alive. By early 1348, the great maritime republics of Italy were crumbling. Venice, the most pragmatic city in Europe, eventually developed something remarkable. They forced arriving ships and crews to wait 40 days outside the city before entering. 40 giorni, 40 days. The origin of our modern word, quarantine. It was one of the first public health measures in history. But for the first wave, it came too late. The gondolas of Venice became funeral barges. The canals fell silent. From the Italian ports, the disease moved west to Marseille, the great gateway to France. Then north along the river valleys. Then east across the Holy Roman Empire. Then further, Scotland, Scandinavia, the remote Norse settlements of Greenland. By 1351, the plague had covered the entire continent. It had followed every road, every river, every sea route that European civilization had so proudly built. Numbers can tell you the scale of the disaster, but they cannot tell you what it felt like to be inside it. Imagine being a doctor in Paris in 1348. You have spent your entire life studying medicine. You are educated, respected, trusted. And now people are dying around you faster than you can count them, and you have no idea why. The best medical minds of the 14th century were not stupid. They were simply operating from a completely wrong framework. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about germ theory. They believed, based on ancient Greek teachings, that disease came from corrupted air, from a poisonous miasma, possibly triggered by a specific alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 that had released noxious vapors from the earth. So they told people not to bathe. Bathing opened the pores to corrupted air. They burned aromatic woods on street corners. They bled patients who were already dying. They lanced the buboes, which only spread the infection deeper into the body faster. Every rational thing they tried made it worse. And the realization that their best knowledge was useless broke something in the psychological fabric of the civilization. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio survived the plague in Florence, a city that may have lost 60% of its population. He left behind accounts that still feel shocking to read today. The bonds of human society simply snapped. Parents abandoned children. Husbands left wives alone to die. The sick were walled up inside their homes. Laws stopped being enforced because the magistrates were dead. Bakeries stopped baking. The sounds of city life, carts, shouting, construction, laughter, were replaced by a heavy, crushing silence, broken only by the church bells, tolling for the dead. Over and over, until the bell ringers themselves died. And then the bells stopped too. The dead piled up faster than the living could bury them. Churchyards overflowed. Massive plague pits were dug on the edges of cities, trenches where bodies were stacked in layers, covered with thin soil, and then another layer stacked on top. And then came the questions that no one could answer. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, why is he doing this? The church, the absolute center of medieval life, had no answer. People flooded into cathedrals, holding mass processions of prayer, which only served to spread the mnemonic form of the plague faster through the crowds. When the prayers failed, and when priests began dying just as quickly as everyone else, something desperate and dark took over. Across northern Europe, the flagellant movement exploded. Hundreds of men marching from town to town twice a day, stripping to the waist in the public square and whipping themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes, drawing blood, weeping, singing, taking the sins of the world onto their own flesh, trying to satisfy a God whose anger seemed impossible to appease. And then came something darker still. If God was not listening, perhaps the devil was at work. Perhaps someone was helping this happen. A conspiracy theory spread through the Holy Roman Empire and parts of Spain that Jewish communities were poisoning the wells of Christendom. Pope Clement VI himself condemned this theory, pointing out that Jews were dying of the plague at exactly the same rate as everyone else. But it didn't matter. The mob doesn't stop for logic when it is terrified. Entire Jewish communities in Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne were rounded up and burned alive. Innocent people massacred because a civilization could not cope with a disease it could not explain. The Black Death did not just kill bodies. It revealed with brutal clarity what people are capable of when they are desperate enough. By 1351, the first great wave had burned itself out. The bacterium had simply run out of easily accessible victims. The fog began to lift, and the survivors looked around at a continent that looked the same buildings, same roads, same fields, but was fundamentally, permanently different. Between 75 and 200 million people had died across Eurasia and North Africa. In Europe alone, historians estimate that somewhere around half the population was gone. In less than 5 years, the immediate aftermath was economic chaos. But then something unexpected happened. With half the workforce dead, the peasants who remained suddenly had something they had never had before in the history of feudal Europe: power. Lords who needed their land worked could no longer dictate the terms. For the first time in centuries, a peasant could walk away and find a better offer from a desperate landowner next door. Wages rose, conditions improved. The rigid hierarchies of serfdom, which had locked the poor into servitude for generations, began to crack and, in many places, eventually broke entirely. The golden age of the laborer was born directly from the worst catastrophe in European history. The art of the period tells you everything about the psychological wound that was left behind. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became one of the most popular artistic motifs of the age. Skeletons dancing with kings, with popes, with merchants, with peasants, all being led to the same grave. Death as the great equalizer, the one force in existence that respected no crown, no wealth, no prayer. The sense that humanity was climbing towards something greater was shattered. What was rebuilt in its place was more skeptical, more willing to challenge authority that had proven itself useless when it mattered most. Some historians trace a direct line from the psychological rupture of the Black Death to the Renaissance, to the Reformation, to the beginning of the modern world. A civilization forced by catastrophe to ask, for the first time, if the Church cannot save us, who can? If the ancient authorities have no answers, where do we look? The plague cleared the ground, violently, brutally, at unimaginable cost. But what grew in the ashes was a different kind of Europe. Empty streets, locked homes, a fear of the air itself, a disease spreading along trade routes, carried by people who didn't know they were sick, reaching city after city before anyone understood what was happening. Governments scrambling for answers, doctors operating without the right tools, people looking for someone to blame, communities tearing themselves apart under the weight of collective fear. Does any of that sound like ancient history to you? The Black Death was the greatest trauma Western civilization has ever survived. It exposed every weakness in the systems humans had built, medical, social, political, spiritual, and it did not look away. But here is what I keep coming back to. The civilization that was destroyed by the plague was the one that had made the plague possible. Too dense, too connected, too confident, too unprepared for what interconnection truly means. And the civilization that was built on the other side of it, more humble, more questioning, more aware of its own fragility, that civilization eventually produced modern medicine, modern governance, germ theory, vaccines, the tools that, centuries later, would make it possible to fight back. Every test leaves a scar, but every scar is also evidence of survival. I'll see you in the next one.